Welcome to the recorded version of Caregiving Along the Care Continuum, part of the Family Caregiver Support webinar series brought to you by the American Society on Aging, and a generous sponsorship from Home Instead Senior Care. Okay, our presenter today is Lakeland Hogan. Lakeland is a gerontologist and caregiver advocate for Home Instead Senior Care. Lakeland works to educate professionals, families, and communities on issues older adults face. Lakeland is a doctoral candidate at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, where she is studying social gerontology. She has a Master of Arts in Social Gerontology and a Master's in Business Administration from UNO. Lakeland has professional experience in the private and public sectors of senior care services. She has worked on special projects for UNO's Department of Gerontology and the local area agency on aging. Lakeland serves as Vice President of the Board of Directors for the Dreamweaver Foundation and is active in the Alzheimer's Association's Walk to End Alzheimer's. Lakeland has a passion for helping others, especially aging adults and their families. And with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Lakeland Hogan. Thanks for being here, Lakeland.
Thank you so much, Steve. Hello, everyone. I am so glad that you're joining us today for our Caregiving Along the Care Continuum webinar. Again, I just want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to learn about a topic that is really important. We know that family caregivers provide vital support to their aging loved ones, and we're going to be talking today about that support and how it changes along the care continuum. And this is a caregiver support webinar series, so it's really important for us to learn more about this caregiving journey. And we know that this journey really looks different for everyone. It can last a few months, perhaps after a loved one has a procedure, or caregiving can be a role somebody takes on for several years, supporting their loved one who has chronic conditions. And it can even last several decades for individuals caring for a loved one with Parkinson's or a type of dementia, such as Alzheimer's disease. But regardless of what the journey looks like, caregivers are likely to come to us as professionals at some point in that caregiving journey for support and resources and encouragement. So the more we know about caregiving across the care continuum, the better positioned we will be to support them. So with that, I'll turn to the next slide so we can look at some of our objectives for today's webinar. So I'm going to start by describing the care continuum for aging adults, and then I'm going to talk about identifying the caregiving role and how that role changes over time. And then we're going to talk about some signs that we can tell caregivers to look for when there might need to be a change in the care that they're either providing to their loved one, or maybe a change in terms of moving them to a facility or bringing in outside assistance. We'll also talk about the importance of self-care for family caregivers. And I always, when I bring up caregiver self-care, it can seem like a really simple topic, but it's so important and one that we cannot stress enough because so often it goes by the wayside because family caregivers give and give and give, and sometimes they don't take the time to check in with themselves and make sure that they're doing well and can continue to provide that care for their loved ones. And so finally, I'm going to offer up some tips and resources that we can pass along to caregivers to support them and prevent burnout. So I thought we'd start by just reviewing the care model. For so long, the options for care were quite limited, and now we have more options than ever for aging and support services. So from a bird's eye view, this slide kind of gives you an idea of the care model for aging adults. On the left side of the screen, you can see independence. So this is where an older adult is still able to handle their own instrumental activities of daily living, those IADLs, and those activities of daily living, those ADLs. So IADLs are things like bill pay, meal preparation, driving themselves to appointments. And then activities of daily living are those more personal cares, bathing, grooming, using the restroom, and so forth. And then as they start to need more help with those types of activities, their family members start to chip in and help. They're often first to provide that extra support needed. And then there might be a variety of intermediate services, which we'll cover on the next slide. And then at some point there might be a need to move to a facility, or at the end of life, families might opt for hospice care. So again, that's just a wide lens, bird's view of the care model. And so if we dive a little deeper into the various types of care, you'll see that a senior living spectrum is vast. So I found this graphic in an article that I recently read. It was written by Leo Anderson. It was published in 2017, but I thought that it captured the senior living spectrum really well. With so many options available, it can really be helpful to see a visual of how the services can overlap, how much support and supervision is offered in the various types of services. So you can see on the x-axis the level of care and supervision, and on the y-axis the cost. So again, this is a nice visual to show different models of care. And as you can if you look back to the last slide, you can see that the model of care that I just went over kind of is mimicked here on the senior living spectrum. So if you look to the left side of the graphic, you'll see various types of independent living that is available. So things like senior apartments, retirement communities that are really geared towards that 55 plus demographic. They're still very independent. They may or may not have activities. They may or may not offer meals in kind of a group setting, but you may find that type of service offering in an independent living facility. So as we start to move across the spectrum towards the right side of the screen, you'll see independent living, and then assisted living facilities offer more of those personal care assistance, medication management, and Alzheimer's and dementia care can be offered in either an assisted living setting or in a skilled setting, and offer more around-the-clock supervision, oftentimes in a secured area. And then if we look to the very right of this spectrum, you'll see nursing home and hospice care, which have very high levels of care and support. And again, these services, some of them can be offered across the entire spectrum. So if you look at the CCRC, that bubble towards the top, that stands for Continuing Care Retirement Community. And oftentimes these are campuses with the full spectrum of services. So that might be offered within one high-rise building in a more densely populated urban area, or it could be on a campus of various buildings and maybe a more suburban setting. But again, an individual could enter in the assisted living portion of a CCRC, and then as their needs grow, the CCRC might be able most likely to accommodate those changing care needs. And then if you look at the bottom, in-home senior care also can span the senior living spectrum, as it can be provided in a residential setting, in that independent setting. It can also be provided in the various facilities. So again, I just go over this briefly to let you know that there are various settings of which older adults can age in, and the caregiving role is going to look a little bit different in all of those areas. So just something to keep in mind as we think about how caregiving changes as an individual kind of progresses through some of these various senior living scenarios. So we've been talking a lot about the caregiver, so I thought we'd put a little definition to it, that term, caregiver. But the challenging thing is there's really not a clear definition, because the definition is dependent on the context in which the term caregiver is used. However, caregiving generally reflects an extraordinary level of care that exceeds the bounds that is typically considered normative. So when an individual provides care for another, that's again typically extraordinary or outside of those traditional either friendship bounds or family bounds. So the term caregiver again can be used in a variety of ways, and I like to kind of break it into two categories. So we have the formal and informal caregivers. So if we look at the informal caregivers, this could be a spouse providing care to another spouse. You can see that in the first picture in the top left. It could also be an adult child providing care to a parent, or a friend helping out a neighbor, or maybe a niece helping out a great aunt. You can see that kind of depicted in that top right picture. And then if we look to a more formal caregiver, these are considered to be trained professionals. They could work for a home care company like Home Instead. They could work in a care facility, memory care unit, assisted living facility, or they could even sometimes be a healthcare professional. Sometimes they're referred to as a caregiver. But for the purpose of today's presentation, I'm going to mostly be referencing that informal caregiver, but did just want to differentiate that sometimes those terms are kind of thrown around for a variety of individuals that are providing care. But again, today we're going to be focused mainly on that family caregiver or a friend who's providing care to another friend, neighbor, or a significant person in their life. So I mentioned earlier that care responsibilities often fall first to the family caregiver, so I thought we'd just talk a little further about that. So if an older adult is in need of support and assistance, family typically is the first to step in. And when that responsibility falls on the family caregiver, it generally falls first to who we would consider to be the primary caregiver. This primary caregiver takes on the majority of the care or the care coordination. And there's also likely to be secondary caregivers that help the primary caregiver with the variety of responsibilities or a variety of care tasks that are needed. And then when we look at who within the family steps in to provide care, typically we see the spouse is the first to take on the caregiving role. However, if that spouse is unable to perform caregiving duties, maybe due to limited mobility or their own health issues, or if they have passed away, then the adult child typically steps in. And if we look at the demographics of caregiving, family caregiving, the most common caregiver is the adult daughter. And sometimes she is sandwiched between providing care for her aging parent and her own children or grandchildren. So today's adult child family caregivers, sometimes referred to as the sandwich generation, again caring for both aging parents and young children in their lives. And something that is also important to note about family caregiving responsibilities is that some family members take on this caregiving role willingly, while some feel that the role was thrust upon them or that they are doing it out of a sense of obligation. And this results in great differences among caregivers and the pressure that they feel to take on the role in the first place. We also see a variance in their expectations concerning the duties that they're willing or feeling obligated to perform. So again, every caregiving situation is so different. So we really need to be sensitive to their individual situation and try to learn about the specifics. That way we can best help them along this caregiving journey. So while we see family members stepping in to take on this role, we're also seeing a shift in the number of family caregivers available. So the Home Care Association of America and the Global Coalition on Aging put out a report called The Value of Home Care. And in this report, it highlights the shrinking family caregiver pool. So this graphic, which is taken from the report, shows on the left-hand side that today, on average, there are 7 family caregivers for every 1 older adult. This number is predicted to shrink from 7 to just 4 caregivers by the year of 2030. And then that number is estimated to shrink even further from 4 to 3 caregivers by the year 2050. So by the year 2050, there's estimated to only be about 3 family members to every 1 aging senior in the U.S. So that's going to cause a lot of challenges in the future. And another challenge is that the distance between family members is growing. At least one potential family caregiver is approximately 280 miles from their loved one. And this, again, can present some additional challenges. Long-distance caregiving may be especially challenging if the long-distance caregiver is the primary caregiver for the aging loved one. So, while this number of family caregivers is shrinking, they still make up a very large group of individuals, and they do have a pretty significant economic impact. So it's estimated that family caregiving accounts for, or is valued at, $470 billion. So and this number comes to us from a report done by AARP called Valuing the Invaluable. So this number, $470 billion, is about equal to the annual sales of Walmart, which is one of the world's largest companies. So this number just goes to show that family caregivers are really vital to the care of aging adults. Again, if we were to total up all of the care that they're providing, it's equivalent to one of the world's largest companies. And then if we look at the sheer number of family caregivers, the Caregiving in the U.S. study estimates that about 43.5 million adults serve as family caregivers, and of that number, about 16.1 million are caring for people living with dementia. And I drew out that number specifically because we find that dementia and Alzheimer's family caregivers indicate a higher level of strain and burden than the average family caregiver due to the additional challenges of caring for someone living with dementia. So again, we want to get to know the family caregiver and the specifics of their situation to learn how we can best assist them. So now that we've established the prevalence and the importance of caregiving, I want to dive into how the caregiving role really changes over time. So Montgomery and Kozlowski developed the caregiver identity theory to help explain the evolution of the caregiving role. And the basis for this theory is that the caregiving role emerges from an existing role relationship in a series of phases. The caregiving role should not really be seen as a new role, they say, but rather it's most helpfully viewed as a transformation of an existing role relationship. But the thing is, the individual might not notice that they're experiencing these various phases, but it can be helpful to us as professionals to understand these phases to help us indicate, where in this caregiving journey are they at. So the theory suggests that there are 4 stages with a possible 5th stage. So I'm going to walk through each of these phases and show you how the role of the caregiver morphs over time. So I'm going to be showing you a series of visuals, and in the visuals, the tan color is the familial role. When I say familial role, it's really that family role. So wife, spouse, daughter. For those that are not related by blood, it could be their friendship role, that sort of thing. And then the turquoise color will be indicating how the caregiving role is increasing over time. So in phase 1, this occurs when the caregiver begins to perform caregiving activities that have not traditionally been part of his or her familial role or friendship role. So for example, a wife's husband has dementia and it has progressed, and in phase 1, she might take on the financial tasks, which had always been part of her husband's responsibility in the marital division of labor. Another example could be an adult son who has to start taking his mother shopping for groceries because his mom has some sort of mobility issue and cannot get herself to the grocery store on her own. So in phase 1, the person is just starting to take on a few caregiving tasks, again, outside of what they traditionally would engage in terms of a relationship with the care recipient. And then at this point, they're still really not perceiving themselves as a caregiver. But if we look to phase 2, this is when the caregiver begins to perform more of these caregiving activities. And they begin to start to realize that these are, in fact, caregiving activities, and they do expand beyond the scope of that family or friendship role. And they also might start to recognize that, yes, I am a caregiver. And then in phase 3, the care needs start to increase in the number of tasks and the intensity level needed to complete the tasks. The care recipient requires more caregiving activities that are at this point substantially beyond the traditional boundaries of their original friendship or family role. And in many cases, the activities involve assistance with personal care. For some family members, this personal care might be uncomfortable or cause discomfort to the family member or to the care recipient. In phase 3, sometimes family members will choose to step out of the caregiving role or they'll start to bring in resources to help supplement those caregiving activities that they're not comfortable or able to provide. But for those that continue in the role, In phase 3, their caregiving role really starts to account for about at least half of their role relationship. And then in phase 4, the caregiver is providing care to the care recipient, and that recipient is almost completely dependent on that caregiver. The caregiving role dominates the relationship, and that family role or friendship role has been minimized. And at this point in the caregiving journey, this is where caregivers are at high risk for burnout. They might be seriously considering moving their loved one to a facility or bringing outside help in to supplement their family caregiving. And then some caregivers might make it to what is considered to be phase 5, but not all caregivers will experience this phase. However, if the care recipient is moved into a care facility, or if the family decides to bring in outside help, the caregiving role might be reduced so that they could potentially resume part of that family role again. And while the family caregiver does not cease all caregiving activities, there still has to be some care provided. It's really a new arrangement that allows, again, for some of those original caregiving original familial family roles, friendship roles to be re-engaged. So again, this gives you a quick overview of the various phases of caregiving. And Montgomery and Kozlowski realized that navigating these changes in the caregiver identity in these various phases can be challenging. So they offer up some suggestions on how to reduce the distress that comes through these various stages. So there are some ways to reduce that distress that can be helpful for us as professionals in the field to understand, because caregivers, again, often reach out to us when they are experiencing high stress. They're kind of at their wits' end. So they reach out to professionals, and we can help them in several ways by engaging in conversation with the caregiver about their role. Talk to them about what is important to them as a caregiver and how they could best utilize support and resources. So first, we really want to understand what they think their role as a caregiver is. What do they think they should be doing? And then if needed, we can help them think of ways that they can change caregiving activities to bring those ideals in line with what they're actually doing. So sometimes we can be quick to assume that the caregiver would really benefit for some respite. They're really stressed out. They could benefit from some respite. Or if we could just get somebody in there to clean the house for them, it would free up so much of their time. Or we could hire somebody, or we could look into a bath aide to come in and provide those personal care services. But we need to check in with the caregiver to make sure that they would truly benefit, because the worst case scenario would be to set up these services and activities and then have the caregiver cancel them, which sometimes happens and really is unfortunate, because our goal is, of course, to help the caregiver along this journey. So a good example of this would be if a wife, she really cherished her familial role and really enjoyed the housework. It was a way for her to de-stress. She might want to continue doing that housework. So instead of hiring somebody to come in to provide for some of those housekeeping needs, perhaps instead she would benefit from respite care to free up some of her time so she could do those household chores that she still feels very closely, feels a close sense of identity to, and again helps her relieve some stress. Or perhaps if a husband, he's never cooked in the familial role, and his wife is no longer able to do so, he might be overwhelmed by meal preparation. He might rather have somebody come in to cook so he can continue spending time with his wife, or he might benefit from a meal delivery service as a way to support him and provide, of course, for their nutritional needs. We may also need to talk with the caregiver about changing his or her perception of the caregiving role. We may need to point out all the things that they're doing really well and then address some areas where they could use some added support. So for example, if a daughter feels she's not doing a good job as a family caregiver, she feels like her siblings aren't doing enough to help out, they're criticizing her, she's really second-guessing herself as a caregiver, we could encourage her to join a support group or to seek out counseling to reframe her perspective. Talking with other caregivers might help her to realize she really is in a situation that others are experiencing, she is doing a good job, especially in the circumstances that she's been presented. So she might benefit from other support resources, again, such as a support group or maybe some support in areas where her siblings are unable or unwilling to help out. And finally, we can help them change their identity standard, as Montgomery and Kozlowski refers to it. And this may be encouraging them to embrace their new role as a caregiver, or to let go of some of those aspects of that familiar role that they're holding on to. This could be helping the caregiver accept their loved one as they are now and appreciate the little ways that they can still connect to that family role or friendship role that they once had. And again, this might be a good time to suggest professional counseling, and that could help encourage and provide additional emotional support as they go through this identity change or caregiver identity change process. So again, these approaches can be helpful, but it really depends at the end of the day on how open the caregiver is to discussing their situation and helping with various support along the way. And then one last thing I wanted to touch on in regards to this identity change theory is how it can be applied to professional caregivers. So I presented this theory to various groups of aging professionals, and some of the professional caregivers that I've talked to have mentioned how this identity change theory can sometimes happen to them in reverse. For some, they start out as that professional caregiver when they first meet the patient or client. So on the right-hand side, you can see the tan graphic. They are full-on professional caregiver, but then as they continue to work with their client, get to know them or their patient, they really start to feel like family. And I know that this happens to many of our caregivers at home instead. It's also happened to me when I was a client care coordinator. The more you work with aging adults, you start to learn their story, their history, and you really start to connect with them. And there was one client in particular that comes to mind. Her name was Ethel, and her children were all long-distance caregivers. So I really was the point person. I helped arrange her professional caregivers in the home. I went to all of her appointments to take notes from the doctor and report back to her children. I also, when she had a stroke, sat with her in the ER to make sure she wasn't alone during those frightening times. So really, she became like an extended member of my family even. But as a professional, it can be really hard to walk that fine line of compassion, treating your patients like family, and maintaining that professional boundary. It's really easier said than done a lot of times. It can be hard not to get too emotionally attached. But again, I thought that was interesting that several professional caregivers have said, as I was learning about this theory, I realized it kind of happens to me in reverse. So I thought I'd just share that quick to kind of sum up the caregiver identity change theory. And then there's another model of the caregiving journey that I want to share with you today. So the AgeWell Hub puts together a caregiver journey map to better understand the roles of various types of caregivers over time and the challenges that they face along the way. They've done this for Alzheimer's family caregivers, and I also know that they've done it for military and veteran caregivers as well. So today I wanted to just walk through the Alzheimer's family caregiver journey map, and if you are really interested, this document is pages long. I'm going to try to summarize it in a matter of one slide in a few minutes, but you can download the full document at caregiving.org, and I'm going to share that website again at the end on the resource slide. But this caregiver journey map talks about each kind of stage of the caregiving journey and looks at it in a variety of categories. So they look at health and safety, social well-being, care coordination, financial and legal, and the caregiver's quality of life. It also takes into consideration aspects of the caregiver's life, such as work and family, and how they have to balance those things along their caregiving journey. So with this particular caregiver, we're going to call her Kathy. You can see here that her caregiving journey is quite long. Kathy's caring for her mother who's living with Alzheimer's disease, and Kathy goes through various phases of the caregiving journey as her mom progresses through the various stages of the disease. So you can notice in phase 1, at this point, Kathy is starting to notice changes in her mom. She's trying to figure out, is this normal aging? Kathy's mom has had a few minor car accidents. She starts becoming a little socially withdrawn. She kind of quits her book club that she's always enjoyed going to. And as a result, Kathy is starting to have to check on her mom a little more than usual. So she's starting to miss a few more days of work, leaving a little bit early to go check on her mom. And then she moves into phase 2. So in phase 2, she starts to notice that, okay, I know these are not normal signs of aging. I've talked to some of my friends. Their parents don't seem to be exhibiting some of these same symptoms, but I'm not sure what's going on. So Kathy starts making adjustments even more. She starts to miss work to take her mom to all of these doctor's appointments to try to figure out what's going on, what's causing this abnormal behavior. Her children are starting to notice that she's spending more time with grandma and missing more of their sporting games and school activities. So she's starting, again, to have to check in on her mom more regularly, a couple times a week. So she's gone from maybe checking on her once a week to a couple times a week, checking in with her daily by phone, really making adjustments in her daily schedule. And then as she moves to phase 3, she starts to have to shift her priorities a little bit. So her mom officially gets diagnosed with dementia. She's left wondering, what do I do now? She knows that her mom requires more assistance. She's checking on her pretty much daily at this point because her mom has started to wander. The neighbor found her down the street a little confused. At this point, Kathy's taking on more of the financials and other household tasks, and she really stops doing some of those self-care activities like exercising, socializing with Kathy's own friends. Her family had to cancel their spring break vacation, and Kathy's finding that her husband's having to take on more of their household responsibilities because Kathy's over at mom's far more often. And then in the next phase, Kathy experiences increasing demands. She starts to wonder if she can continue to take care of her mom. She's hired some part-time help to come in just so she has a little peace of mind while she's at work, but she is having to take more time off work and not spending nearly enough time with her family. And she's really helping with her mom's personal cares at this point, and really helps to coordinate all of her care. She finds herself wondering, how much longer can I take care of mom? And she starts to wonder, is mom safe? Kathy's realizing her mom is really needing full-time care. And between family members splitting up the care schedule, she has a brother. Sometimes her own children go over to help. She's cut back to part-time at work so that she can be there more often, and she's constantly in a state of worry. And she's starting to wonder, would a move to a facility be appropriate for my mom just because she really needs that care and attention? And then she comes into the final stage of her mom's life. So Kathy's mom's Alzheimer's disease has really progressed, and she decides, I do need to move mom into a facility, but she's still finding her caregiving role challenging. She's in touch with the facility several times a day. She's visiting daily. She's worried about the financials of paying for the facility care, and she's also worried, again, about spending enough time with her family. And she feels guilty for moving her mom into a facility and second guesses that decision. So, and then even after Kathy's mom passes away, she feels a little relief, but feels guilty about the relief, and then she's trying to transition back to normal life. So I think that this caregiver journey map really creates a whole picture of what a caregiving journey can entail. And I know that an Alzheimer's family caregiver journey is very different than maybe an individual who has several chronic conditions or a long-distance caregiver. But again, it just paints a picture of the different balancing acts that have to take place as a family caregiver. And there's one more visual that I thought was neat that comes from this Age Well Hub. It shows the competing demands of a family caregiver. And as you can see, throughout Kathy's journey, she starts out with that once-a-week visit and then grows to nearly providing care 24/7. Her personal life really has dwindled, as did her time for family. She's cut back at work. And this, again, this caregiver journey is all too real for so many Alzheimer's family caregivers. But could look different, again, depending on how many people are available within the family unit to support the individual that's needing care, depending on the resources, the financials. There's so many things that play into it. But you can see how, as Kathy's mom kind of moved through the care spectrum, moved through the disease process, how she had to shift her roles and responsibilities to best support her mom and provide for her needs. So I mentioned earlier how we'd go over when family caregivers when tips that we can provide family caregivers so they know when to maybe transition the type of care. So in the Kathy example, we talked about how Kathy questioned, do I move my loved one into a facility? Do I bring in outside help? And that can be really challenging for families to try to figure out on their own, especially if they've never cared for a loved one before. So often family caregivers try to shoulder all of the care themselves, and then when they finally do reach out for any sort of help, they can be desperate or at the end of their rope. So hopefully, as we work with family caregivers, we can encourage them to be open to resources and support and to look for several signs to help them determine when it's appropriate to bring in outside help. So I kind of broken it into two categories. On this slide, I'm going to be talking about how to know when it's time to kind of move from independence to support in the home. And then on the next slide, I'm going to go over some signs when it might be time to move from home to a care facility setting. So on this slide, there's so many signs that I wanted to kind of break it down in a digestible way. So there's really three categories that you can think about this in: mental, emotional, and social, and physical and medical. So when we're talking with family caregivers, if they're noticing that their loved one has forgetfulness that's impacting their daily life, if there are accidents in the kitchen, such as the stove being left on, maybe their loved one is having trouble keeping track of their medications, they're missing doctor's appointments or social engagements. I mentioned with Kathy's example, she stopped going to that book club she so enjoyed. So again, might be a sign mails and bills that are piling up that your loved one hasn't gone through. So these are some mental kind of signs that maybe there is some additional support that is needed in the home to help them, continue to stay where they're at if that's what their desire is. And then some emotional and social cues that we can look for: reluctance to leave the house. This might be due to some sort of cognitive impairment. It could be due to mobility limitations. If they're unable to leave the house due to transportation issues, and then they might be withdrawing from social interactions. They might also be exhibiting signs of depression. So those might be some signs that we need to bring in some outside assistance, or maybe the family needs to step up and visit more frequently to offer more support. And then finally, in the physical and medical categories, losing interest in meals. So maybe they're losing interest in cooking and therefore not eating as much, or maybe they have the medical issues like arthritis that's flaring up that's preventing them from cooking those meals. Maybe they're having declining driving skills, and a conversation needs to be had around best transportation options for the individual. If family is noticing that their loved one is not taking care of their personal hygiene like they once were, that could be a sign that some additional assistance is needed. Perhaps they're afraid of showering in the shower because they don't want to fall, or maybe they had a near fall, and some additional home modifications are needed to make that environment more safe for them to use. And if they always had a clean and cleanly home and now it is unkept and messy, that might also be a sign that there's something else going on. So we're talking with families, if we can share these kind of tips with them and these signs to look for, then it might help them know when a conversation is needed around some additional support. And then I often get asked about, when is it the right time to move my loved one from the home to a care facility? So I thought that I'd share a few ideas around this topic. This can really be a tough decision to make. Oftentimes, adult children promise their parent they will never move them to a care facility or nursing home, but sometimes we know that's not feasible to follow through on that promise. There are some general indicators that can help families determine if it's time to move from a home to a facility setting or community setting. The first one might be if we know that they need assistance and they're not willing to accept professional help within the home setting. You've tried everything under the sun. You've tried a variety of home care providers, home health providers, a bath aide, tried engaging family members, but they're really resistant to care in the home. Moving them to a care facility might be really the only option to ensure their safety and well-being. Also, their care needs might go beyond the level of care that's able to be provided in the home. Maybe they have a medical condition, or the layout of the home is really not conducive for living safely. That home environment can no longer be modified to the extent that's needed. I see older adults a lot of times living in those split-level homes, and those can be really challenging to navigate. And so, again, those types of things might be an indicator that it's time to make that move. And then for those living with Alzheimer's or another type of dementia, they might have a behavioral symptom of the disease that might be too much for family members or for a care provider to manage at home. If these symptoms are putting the individual, the care recipient, or the caregiver in danger, it might be, again, a sign that they need to move the individual for everyone's best interest. And then the last one, cost for around-the-clock care inside the home might not be feasible. It just might cost too much to bring in someone. Even if the family tries to create a schedule and supplement with outside help, it just might be more financially conducive to move them into a care facility. And every situation is different, so I know that this doesn't cover, every possible indicator that it's time to make a move from home to facility. Every situation is really going to look different, but these are just a couple things we can keep in mind when we're talking with families about when a care change is needed, when a caregiver gets to a point on that care continuum where they're trying to manage all those demands of caregiving, and something's got to give. Maybe that is bringing support into the home. Maybe it is making a move. But again, this can be a really challenging decision to make, but it's one that should involve the older adult. If at all possible, it should involve the family, as much of the family that can or wants to be involved in the conversation, so that one day the older adult doesn't just walk home and the family says, today's the day we're moving. If we can involve that individual in the conversation as much as possible, hopefully the care decision will be made in the best interest of everyone. So finally, before we go to questions, I do want to address the caregiver self-care. This is something, again, I mentioned, it often falls to the wayside in the caregiving journey. For those that are new to caregiving, we as professionals want to encourage them to make self-care a priority at all phases of this caregiving journey. But for those that are already in the throes of things, we need to remind them of the importance of self-care so that they can continue to go on and provide that much-needed care and support to their loved one. And if they do not take time for self-care, it can really have negative physical, mental, and emotional consequences. I was just at a conference centered around Alzheimer's and dementia and spoke to a woman. She had a really heartbreaking story. She told me she talked about how her father, he was the primary caregiver for her mother who had Alzheimer's disease, and he passed away 9 days before her mother lost her battle to Alzheimer's. So he really let his health take a back seat to hers. He really put all of his energy and effort into making sure his wife with Alzheimer's was well cared for, and unfortunately passed away again 9 days shy of her mother's passing. So I cannot stress enough how important self-care is. And some of these things that I'm going to go through might sound kind of like duh, why is she talking about this? Or these sound so simple or easier said than done. But if we don't take the time to talk about these things and encourage caregivers to engage in these self-care activities, then, they could put their well-being on the back burner and suffer otherwise hopefully preventable consequences. So there's some areas I'm going to first offer up some questions that caregivers can ask themselves. These questions encompass the universal signs of stress. So I think when caregivers are feeling really at times of high stress or de-stress or strain, we can encourage them to do a little self-reflection to see if it's time to implement some of these self-care activities, if they should reach out for help, support, maybe even talk to their healthcare provider about their own health and well-being. So I'll let you kind of read through these questions on your own. But again, these are some quick questions caregivers can ask themselves. And if they answer yes to any of these questions, they really should, again, talk with their healthcare provider about how they can manage these types of challenges in order to help, again, with that self-care. And then there are 4 kind of general areas of caregiver wellness that I'm going to go over quickly before we open up for questions. So acknowledging feelings, releasing those difficult emotions, finding appropriate solutions, and really engaging in enjoyable activities. So if we look at acknowledging the emotions, in an average day or week, caregivers can really experience a wide range of emotions, from happiness and appreciation to satisfaction to frustration, anger, even resentment. And it's important for caregivers to really accept their feelings, both positive and negative, and avoid judging themselves for feeling the way they feel. A caregiver is not a bad person for feeling anger or frustration. And oftentimes they can feel guilty about feelings that they're feeling. We don't want caregivers to have to go through that. So if we want caregivers to look at their situation and acknowledge what they can and cannot control and really accept where they're at emotionally at all times. But more importantly, we want to make sure that they're able to release those feelings in an appropriate and healthy way. Caregivers can find various ways that they can release their feelings on an ongoing basis and really can find what works best for them. So whether it's journaling, engaging in a support group, talking to a non-judgmental friend, which could be hard for some people to find, or a therapist, engaging in exercise, meditation, yoga, or for those that have a more spiritual practice, engaging in prayer. And when I talk with caregivers, they don't have to make drastic changes. They can start small. Maybe it's taking a 20-minute walk on a lunch break, jotting down your feelings while you sip your morning coffee, or meditating for 5 to 10 minutes before going to bed. These quick things can be really implemented into a routine. And then we want to help them find solutions. So when a caregiver is finding burnout or they're finding high levels of strain, we want to make sure that they're developing a healthy support system. We want them, again, to be proactive, get in a good routine of recharging their batteries regularly and spending some time either in their quiet time alone or engaging in those activities that help them to release emotions. And we want to help caregivers also identify what is important to them, choosing their battles wisely, reserving their energy for those worthy causes. And then some additional solutions and ways that caregivers can find enjoyment is to engage in those health-building activities. We want to make sure that caregivers are getting some exercise. Maybe they do a little yoga, meditation, develop interests outside of caregiving. And I know this can be easier said than done, but whether it's a book club or whether it's gardening or cooking, making sure that those passions don't totally fall off the wayside, that caregivers are still engaged in that every so often. And holding a meaningful conversation each day can be really helpful. Sometimes I talk to caregivers who are so isolated, they feel all alone in this journey. They feel like they never even get to talk to another person outside of the care recipient, in a day or week's time. So really being proactive about reaching out. And then, of course, sleep and taking time off or away from the situation, that respite can be extremely helpful in making sure that they get that time to kind of recharge and come back to the situation able to provide the best care possible. Okay, so I know I covered kind of those wellness and self-care tips quickly. I think there are things, again, that we all probably know we should do, but caregivers oftentimes forget or they don't have time for themselves, but we need to encourage them to take those little chunks of time to take deep breaths, to refocus, to recharge so that they can go on to continue providing care along that care continuum. And again, the sooner we can encourage that in their caregiving journey, hopefully the more likely they are to make it a habit over time. So I'm going to go through some resources quick. The first one I want to touch on, we've been talking a lot about family caregivers and how the number of family caregivers, that caregiving pool, is going to dwindle. And at Home Instead, we're trying to help build up the next generation of caregivers. So we started a social movement called Ready to Care. I really love the quote by the former First Lady Rosalind Carter. She says there's 4 kinds of people in the world: those who have been caregivers, who are currently, who will be caregivers, and those who will need caregivers. And through this Ready to Care movement, we're trying to build up that group who will be caregivers. And we do this through weekly care missions. So if you sign up for I'm Ready to Care, you'll go to imreadytocare.com and you'll get a weekly care mission. And these are geared towards individuals who are looking to learn more about seniors and the aging population and caregiving in a fun and engaging way. So I thought I'd just throw that out there. If you have maybe young people in your organization or in your family that you think might be interested in learning more about this caregiving journey, please check out that site. And then next, for families that are maybe at the start of their journey or caregivers who are trying to navigate their loved one's kind of aging plan or aging journey, there's a great free resource at 4070talk.com. There's an aging plan and also this conversation tree, and it goes over all the various aspects of caregiving and what their loved one will likely need through their aging journey, and helps them determine, have we talked about living choices? Have we talked about finances? Have we talked about end-of-life wishes? And again, kind of walks them through the process. So that can be a great tool to help caregivers through that aging journey. And then finally, I just wanted to share some resources. There's a general website called caregiverstress.com. This is a great site that offers up topics all pertaining to caregiving, a variety of topics: medication management, driving, reducing stress. There's a stress assessment caregivers can take on there as well. And then for resources in the local community, the area agencies on aging are fantastic, and caregivers can go to n4a.org to type in their zip code to find the local caregiving organization, local area agency on aging closest to them. And then the National Alliance for Caregiving at caregiving.org, they put out a lot of great reports, and you can also download that Caregiver Journey map from the AgeWell Hub that I mentioned earlier, that story of Kathy caring for her mom with Alzheimer's. You can download that at caregiving.org. Another great national caregiving organization is the Caregiver Action Network. You can get to their website at caregiveraction.org. They have a lot of great, again, resources for family caregivers. careconversations.org also has some great resources. And then I thought I would list out support groups for various disease states, because I know that, again, support groups can be really helpful in helping caregivers, again, connect to other caregivers so they know they're not alone. They can get tips, resources through these various support groups and these various organizations. So the Alzheimer's Association has a great network of support groups. You can go to their website or even call their helpline. A lot of these organizations have a 24/7 helpline that many caregivers don't know about, and they can call to get support and resources, often 24/7, or at least during regular business hours. So the Parkinson's Foundation has support groups and a helpline. For those whose loved one has Lewy body or frontal temporal dementia, those are also disease-specific sites that have caregiver support networks. So, and a lot of the chronic conditions also have great support and resources. So Arthritis Foundation, American Heart Association. So again, we can kind of think about caregiver resources in various buckets. Support groups, those important aging plans and checklists, and then, those emotional supports that we can offer as we help caregivers, again, navigate how their caregiving role is changing. For many, it starts out with just a few, tasks or activities that they help their aging loved one with, and then for some, it can become a full-time job where they're having to give up their work, they're having to take time away from their families, maybe they're taking a hit financially to really take on this important care for those aging individuals in their lives. So thank you so much for joining me. I know that there are many family caregivers out there. Some of you that are listening, you might be professionals in the field and also caring for a family member. So again, just want to thank you for all you're doing to support these family caregivers on their journey. So with that, I know we have a couple minutes for questions. So I will turn it back to Steve for those questions.
Sounds good. Thank you very much, Lakeland. And yes, everyone, it is time for Q&A. So let's dive right into it here, Lakeland. First question for you. Do you have any recommendations for services to the caregiver once their loved one passes away?
That is a great point. I briefly touched on that at the end of describing Kathy's caregiving journey. Caregivers, oftentimes caregiving becomes such an ingrained part of your life that once your caregiving journey is quote unquote over, it can be hard to readapt. I was just talking to an Alzheimer's family caregiver. She's young. She's only 37. She has 2 children, but she was a full-time caregiver for her mom. Her mom lived with her, and now she's trying to kind of find her identity again. So there are some caregiving communities out there. I know sometimes support groups will still allow past caregivers to come. It can be a great way to give back is to help support other caregivers. But counseling is always, or seeking out therapy and counseling services can be helpful in kind of reflecting back and going through those emotions. That's kind of a broad question because there's various aspects of, going through your loved one's things, trying to re-enter the workforce after caregiving perhaps, or rediscovering your passions. So, caregiverstress.com has some resources. There's also, those support groups, online communities, but I think it's important for caregivers to maybe do a little self-reflection. What did that caregiving journey mean to them? And what do they want to do moving forward? Where are they struggling the most? Maybe it is in grieving. Maybe that's where they need to seek out support. Maybe it is trying to figure out, how do I rejoin the workforce? We actually just did an Unretire Yourself campaign. You can find that at unretireyourself.com. And we offer up tips for those who are looking to re-enter the workforce, maybe after retirement. And it could be after your retirement from a caregiving journey, So that might be a good resource for you to look into. But just, again, taking a little time for self-reflection and then seeking out support services in those areas that you're needing the most support in will hopefully help with that post-caregiving journey. But that's a great question.
Okay, thank you. Lakeland, next question. How can we proactively reach caregivers earlier in the journey before they burn out?
That is a great question. If I had the exact answer to that, oh gosh, wouldn't we all sigh a big sigh of relief? I mean, that's kind of, I think, it's a really tough challenge that we have. I think that so often caregivers are in health systems early on with their loved ones, early on in that caregiving journey. So if we can, form alliances with health systems and get them connected early on to those resources, then hopefully we can, again, get to them faster at the start of their caregiving journey. And I think it's important for people who have been through the caregiving journey to share their journey with family members and friends and the support and resources that they've used so that they can kind of pay it forward and reach those caregivers. But, if you're listening and if you have ideas, please type them in to the questions box to that answer, because I get all of that back, and so the next time I do this presentation, I'll be sure to include that. But thank you for that question. I think that we've got to reach them where they're going early on in that journey, and oftentimes it is, online searching and in those healthcare systems.
Okay, Lakeland, can you just circle back real quick to the 40/70 rule and just reiterate a little bit about that, please?
Sure. I'll just go back to that slide real quick. So 40/70 rule, it's kind of a conversation guide, an aging plan. So it goes over the various aspects of aging and really what you'll probably be faced with in your caregiving journey. So topics like finances, your loved one's health and wellness, their end-of-life planning, living choices. And it gives you conversation starters around those topics, because sometimes it can be hard to just bring up the topic with your loved one. So if you go out there to 4070talk.com, there'll be an aging plan that you can download. It's like 40 pages long. It's very in-depth, so you can kind of cherry pick the areas that you're looking to engage in conversation with your loved one. It's great at the beginning of a caregiving journey, even when you're about 40 and your parents are about 70. So if you want to be very, very proactive, that's where the 40/70 rule came from. But I think it can be helpful even into the starts of that caregiving journey to help you really plan ahead for some things that you might be challenged with along the way. That's a great question.
Okay, well, Lakeland, we have reached the end of our hour here, and it's time for us to wrap up, but I want to thank you for a great presentation and for presenting today. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.